Guide to Interpretation, a podcast which takes us deep into the subjects that are of interest to professional interpreters.
My name is Maria Ceballos, and I'm your host.
Welcome, Paul. Welcome, Vinka. Welcome, Carlos.
Welcome, Andrea. Welcome, Janis.
Welcome, Barrie.
What has kept you motivated? What has driven you to continue for the last 25 years when, where perhaps you probably reached a couple of dead ends and weren't sure which way to go next?
Well, the truth is, at the beginning, we did have some big obstacles, especially the bench. The judges were not too excited about knowing about certification or training or whatever, because they wanted an interpreter and they wanted it now. And I'll give you an example. I won't say which state or anything, but I was talking to a judge one time and I said, well, we need an interpreter to start a trial right now. And I said, Your Honor, unfortunately, we were not informed. We're required, and so we can hire the appropriate number of interpreters. And there was a conference going on, and most certifieds are working the conference. And he said, well, then go out there and certify more. That's the understanding they had, that I had like some kind of magic wand, and I go, you're certified, and that's it, right? But that's because we understand, they had their trials and they had their motions and they had their hearings going on, and they couldn't say, well, let's wait for a month until we get an interpreter. So it was a conflict. So, and I think the biggest part has been that, especially for monolingual people, understand the difference between being bilingual and being a court interpreter is tough. And especially because people, when they travel, for instance, and they go to this tour in Italy, and there's Maria, the tour guide who's bilingual and has a funny accent, and she moves her hands a lot, and hey, she can interpret, right? And they don't seem to be aware of the difference between interpreting in a social environment and interpreting in court. So that was one of the most difficult things that we faced. And it took years until we started getting some judges to come, let's say, to our side, to the
dark side?
No, to the other side. From the dark side to the light side.
There you go.
And they actually started becoming champions. I remember Judge Mamia in Washington many years ago, who became a real champion. And I think what was crucial for that is that many judges started going to the consortium conferences as representatives of their state. So it was not only the coordinator, some judges would attend, and they would become aware and see what was going on, and then go and tell others. I think that's what helped us a lot. Judge Chen in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of judges that have helped us by understanding, and not all of them bilingual. Some of them are monolingual and still kind of got it. And now it's the other way around. Now, many judges are actually requiring certification. They're demanding interpreters to be trained. Last year, I was invited here by a judge here in Florida, in the Supreme Court here in Florida, to do a conference for judges from all over the country, and we had something like 170 or something like that. It was a very well attended. I'll tell you, this is the difference. In 1999, we did a conference for judges. And there was a conference for judges that happened to be here in Florida, and there was maybe 300 judges in attendance. And there were, like it happens in conferences sometimes, different seminars being offered at the same time. There was one about court interpretation. There was another one that was being done by a comedian.
Oh.
The comedian had 382 judges, and we had 4. Now it's different. Now we had 100 and some judges. We've had conferences. So that has helped a lot. But that's one of the big changes that we've seen, that now the bench is behind us, at least many of them, and they are aware and they're willing to help us out.
Walk us through a little bit of the process of becoming a certified American Sign Language interpreter. And I understand that there are different categories, and you, as opposed to spoken language interpreters, you guys have a generalist category, and then you have subspecializations. How does that work?
So So we do start with a generalist. There's one exception, which is the educational certification. And there's certainly a lot of debate in the field that people think you should have a generalist before having any specialty, including education. But education is one specialized certificate that you can have without having a generalist. But the way it starts for a generalist, or the way it should start for most people, is that you should come to some form of training program with a base understanding of the language. If you don't have any base understanding of the language, there are college classes that you can take. ASL 1, you start there. ASL 1, ASL 2, ASL 3. Hopefully you go all the way through ASL 6, but hopefully you continue learning ASL your entire life. But you learn, you take deaf culture classes. You learn the language, you learn the vocabulary, but then you learn the culture. You learn the oppression that deaf people have suffered, over the course of history. You go through your classes, you take interpreter training, and now the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf requires that you have a 4-year degree. It doesn't have to be in sign language interpretation, but they do require that you have a 4-year degree. Then you study, you take a written test and a performance test, and if you pass, you get a generalist certification. And it's the same process for the specialties as well. I think one thing that people need to keep in mind is that getting certified, whether it's generalist, education, even legal, that is your entry level into the field and into the profession. There are over 10,000 nationally certified generalist sign language interpreters. There's under 400 that have an SCL, which is the legal certification that I have. And a lot of people think that you have the legal certification, you're this legal interpreting god, and it's entry level. It's just so that you're proficient to do it, and then you continue to train and you continue to gain experience, which makes you a better interpreter.
Now, especially interpreting in court, there's lots of, obviously it's a high risk scenario for defendants, but there's lots of words in the court jargon that can be difficult for an untrained interpreter. I think you and I spoke about the term prison, jail, lockup, and a few others that really have to be interpreted very carefully, because otherwise they create more confusion than what they resolve.
Yes, that's very true. One thing that's interesting, because you did want to talk about some of the differences, I think for the most part, spoken language interpreters, when they're going to a court setting, it is mostly either the defendant or the plaintiff. It's a party to the case that's involved. Sign language interpreters have a little bit of an expansion. You and I have talked about this in Georgia, where sign language interpreters might be called for jury duty. Because exclusion of a deaf person because they don't speak English would be a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So sign language interpreters also interpret jury duty. So yes, there's a lot of people that are affected by the interpreter, even a defendant who isn't the deaf person, or there's not a deaf person to the party or to the case. If the deaf person's on the jury, the skill of that interpreter will affect someone who doesn't know any deaf people or has no relation to any deaf people. And it is very true that those specific words, I actually saw you say this, I've said this a lot in one of your other podcasts, you have to know 4 languages to be a court interpreter. You have to know your source and target languages, but then you have to know legalese in both your source language and your target language.
As an interpreter, you and I both know that acronyms are difficult under any circumstance. But when it comes to LGBTQ plus issues, there's a lot of distinctions and nuances that need to be considered. What should we know about this alphabet soup?
Okay, well, everyone is pretty familiar with the basics. The LGBT, which is what came out first, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, was the very first acronym that was widely used. And you and I have discussed in the past how sometimes it's regionally used differently. So some places use LGTB or GLBT. I personally like to put the L first for lesbians because women tend to come second in society in general. And so I want to put them in the front to promote them and put them in a higher position. And so then the Q got added later, and the Q, I always get asked about the Q, or you could say I always get questioned about the Q, because the Q is very complex. Actually, it's not as straightforward as everyone thinks. It does refer to queer, but it can also refer to questioning. So that's why I intentionally use that phraseology in my response. So queer can mean any of the other words. So any of us who are either lesbian, gay, or bisexual or trans could also call ourselves queer. Which just basically means outside of the norm, and used to be used as an offensive term, and then it got kind of adopted. It got co-opted by the LGBTQ plus community, so to take away the sting of the slur. And so now we proudly, some of us, call ourselves queer, although I would say that the older you go in terms of generation, some of the older generations don't appreciate that term queer because they remember those times when it came across as a very hard sting. But these days, a lot of people actually prefer queer than the other ones because the other ones are too whitewashed in a way, you could say. But then the questioning is also very important to include under the Q, because it also refers to people who say, well, I'm not really sure where I stand yet, so I'm still trying to figure it out. But they're basically saying already, I'm not going to put myself in a box. I'm not conforming. And so all of that LGBTQ plus acronym basically refers to that, to non-conforming. And nowadays, the reason you include the plus, or I include the plus, even though I'm not seeing it widely used yet, is because there's several other letters in that acronym that are also important and need to be included. And the main one right now is non-binary people. So you can be trans and non-binary. And there's also intersex and asexual. So there's obviously a lot of different letters that can be included, as you say, in that alphabet soup. And sometimes people complain that it could get too long, and that's why I at least include the plus, so that that you can be more inclusive as opposed to exclusive, which is, when you're excluded, you don't appreciate it, and that's how the acronym started in the first place.
What's interesting about the headset is that it is one of those bits of equipment for the interpreter that an interpreter should probably carry with them everywhere they go and wherever they are, if they are working. You never know when you're going to be handed a receiver, a transceiver, or anything else, and you might want to use the equipment that you are familiar with in terms of your the fit, in terms of your familiarity with it, and especially now with COVID times, it's probably okay to plug your headphones into a piece of equipment, but you're probably going to feel a lot more comfortable if you bring your own headset, since this is something that you are going to personally be using in your on your body.
I absolutely agree. Yes, that is the best way.
But moving on, so we've got our headset, and that's, I guess, our most easily accessible portable piece of equipment for an interpreter. But let's move into the office. Internet is really is having a fast internet is key, isn't it?
It is definitely. I know I had said the word essential when it comes to the microphone, but the microphone, of course, is connected to the computer. But for your whole operation, I would say, and everybody can see this very easily, the most critical point for your presence in whatever method you're using online, for your online presence, is the internet. So you have to make sure that you are using a very robust internet connection, whether it's Wi-Fi or wired connection, meaning if you're connected by an Ethernet cable, which is always the best recommendation. But it doesn't mean that if your best option is to use Wi-Fi instead of like a long Ethernet cable going through your kitchen and going to, in a way that you cannot hide it, or it's going to be even a hazard or an eyesore. You can use, there's some myth, it's a very big myth that, Wi-Fi, it's really dangerous. Okay, yes, anything could happen at any point. If you lose internet altogether, even the Ethernet cable is not going to be able to do anything. But if you have a very robust internet connection, you should be fine. You have to follow some critical, rules of thumb that will allow you to have the best uninterrupted connection. Meaning you have to make sure, of course, that you are close or closer to the router, if possible, when as much as possible. And if you use more than one connection, if your network, or if you have more than one network at home, or from at the location where you're working from, you make sure that you're the only one using that network, that connection, as much as possible.
Some of the situations that interpreters consider to be part of their regular work. In other words, having to deal with people talking at the same time, having to ignore the construction outside, also having people maybe not even, ignore the interpreters, that the interpreters in the room, or maybe even attempt to speak the language the interpreter is speaking. Mm-hmm. That these things that we normally encounter and we consider to be normal for us can actually be quantified and can actually be taken and measured so that we understand what the effect on our cognitive load is.
Yes, and that's the entire premise of it, is that if you look at the absolute basic definition of interpreting, or just a really simple, superficial way of thinking about what we're doing, that in and of itself, just hearing information, processing it, and then transmitting it into another language requires an incredible amount of concentration and an incredible amount of cerebral energy, if you think about it like a gas tank. And then in addition to that already very, very complicated job, you have disruptions coming at you. And those disruptions are things that an interpreter has to attend to, in addition to the already quite full plate that she already has in trying to take this information about a bone marrow transplant, or a new monoclonal antibody treatment, or complications around a thyroid issue and metastasizing cancer. That in and of itself is a very complicated process for the interpreter. But when you're having to attend to all these disruptions to your concentration, and also the additional decisions you're making, do I stop everything? Do I not? Do I interrupt for this purpose? Do I not? That in and of itself is another form of cognitive load. It's a decision fatigue. And then there's the sheer fact that we have to concentrate for long periods of time, just really excessive concentration. All of these things in the literature are proven to cause mental fatigue. We've just never quantified it for an interpreter. And there are, and this, I think this is one of the seeds that had been planted prior to Natalie Kelly posing that question. I had a couple instances where I just, over the years, had walked out of an interpretation and I thought, God, that was weird. Like, I'm so exhausted and it was only 20 minutes. And another one, and that was with one particular nurse, I won't name names, lovely person, but very, very, very complicated assignment. And then I had another one that was hours. They had no one that could come and cover me. So I was there for hours. And it was a very complicated conversation about bone marrow transplant and an embryo being used essentially to make sure that they would be a match for a transplant later on in this child's life with a new baby. It was a very complicated conversation, and it was hours, and I wasn't fatigued. And I remember walking out of that and thinking, that's really weird. Like, why am I not? Like, if it is true that the longer it is, you should be that much more fatigued, how is it that I'm not? And so those little seeds were planted. And so once we got to this stage with the research, I think the desire really is to quantify it and to be able to calculate what kind of workload really is occurring for interpreters. And most of the time, if you think about it, this tool could be used as a retrospective kind of analysis, right? You look at the last quarter. As a manager, you look at the last quarter and try to understand, okay, I had 62% productivity, just looking on the surface at the basic calculation of hours paid divided by hours worked. But if you add the complexity factor, which the tool would allow a manager to take a look at that based on the interpreter's tracking with the tool of their assignments, some of which, like I said, are perfect, and some have elements of complexity, and some can really knock you over the head. With adding that, that gives them a way to look at workload and productivity in the same way that other service lines do. The ICU staffs nurses very different, or the intensive care unit is staffed. It has more nurses than a clinic environment. There's one nurse to each patient generally, and maybe 2 patients per nurse. In a clinic environment, which is very low complexity or low acuity, you might have multiple patients for one nurse, because the complexity and the workload is lower in terms of what is required of that nurse and the resources that the patient needs.
All of the information that you've gathered over the years, you have obviously done presentations and you've shared it with colleagues, and I believe that you're one of the most generous in spirit colleagues that I know, because you share your knowledge freely in any way that you can, but sometimes you actually have to put it down in a very organized manner so that people can actually work it out from A to Z, so to speak. So you've put together a course for authorship program in the La Mora Institute of Interpretation, in which you actually not just go over the things that we've talked about today, but you actually walk translators and interpreters through all the things that they need to do to establish their social media presence, etc. Tell me more.
One of the issues that we have is when we go to work and nobody knows how to handle us, and we really hate that. Yeah, like being called a translator.
And when you're an interpreter, of course.
Yes. So I started by helping those who are going to take the course to understand the parts of a website, the mechanics of it, how it works, how it gets together, how it gets put together, the need for having a professional do the work. Okay, you are learning the language that this individual is going to be used when talking with you. It's not for you to learn. I'm not teaching you to do a website. No, I'm teaching you to understand what is required, so you understand the price you're being charged. And you also can prepare yourself. You select your pictures, the text you want on your website, identifying the clients you're going to be writing for and attracting with your material. All that is very important. So that is the one part about websites. I also talk about communicating with your clients in a positive way. Just as I mentioned before, I do 3 or 4 times a year. It's not all the time. It's not every time something happens, but it's important for you to stay top of mind. So there are companies that do mass email distribution. However, they do so in a way that each one of those emails come up to the individual in the to area. It's directly to that individual, and you feel respected, represented. It's not like when we receive emails from agencies, dear linguist, I have a name. I want you to use my name. I like it. So that's another thing I do talk about, and we actually get to create one of those messages. So it's very interesting. And I also talk about a program that actually it's what they call SAS. It's a service as software as a service, SAS, software as a service, that is online. It's free. You can pay if you want. You can have a paid account, but it's also free. And the features allowed for you to create nice graphics. They have already templates. All you do is go there, change the picture, change the text, but you leave the lettering, you leave the colors. So you make it your own.
The difference between what a federally certified court interpreter is and what a state certified interpreter is.
Sure. State certified interpreters take a credentialing exam or go through some sort of credentialing instrument, generally designed either by the state or they have joined what used to be known as a consortium. So they have a test provided by the National Center for State Courts. Whereas in federal court, there is one test only for anybody who wants to be certified to work in federal court. So I would say basically the difference is that states may have different testing instruments, whereas the federal court has only one testing instrument.
Now, would you say that working in federal court is very different from working in state court?
It has been my experience that working in state court is a little more hectic. You never know exactly what to expect. You may be running from one court to the other because they call you at the last minute that they need someone. In federal court, it's a little bit less hectic in the sense that usually interpreters know where they're going to be, when, what time, what judge, etc. Federal courts also pretty much follow the same scripts no matter where you go. It's the same procedure no matter which federal court you go to, with very, very few differences. Whereas in state court, you have all kinds of different crimes to begin with, different terminology for each state, different perhaps even procedures for state courts. And the variety is amazing. In state court, you can go all the way from a criminal murder trial to a landlord-tenant dispute. It's really, I find state court to be so challenging and such a fertile ground for learning that I have to say that I admire state court interpreters.
Having said that, though, becoming a federal interpreter seems to be a rite of passage with a lot of interpreters. Why do you think that is?
I believe that the level of proficiency that is expected of a federal court interpreter is quite strict. And that is perhaps a difference between what state courts test and what the federal courts test. So the threshold for the state court interpreter, even though it may be high, it's not going to be as high as the federal courts. So state court interpreters need to work a little harder to develop their vocabulary, from A to C and all kinds of subject matters, and also learn this whole new terminology that is used in legal proceedings in federal court that is not necessarily the same as state courts. So I would say the difference is you need to push yourself a little harder, a little more to get that federal certification. But once you're there, don't think you have arrived because you still have to keep learning.
Now, there are different types of ways that a person can work in federal courts. You could be an independent contractor, a staff interpreter, a supervisor or coordinator, and you've covered all of these over your career. So for our listeners, let's talk about the differences between each roles and start with independent contractors.
Independent contractors have to know how to get the people contracting, hiring, to keep you in mind, because there are so many other people that want to work, and the contracting person, whether it's a supervisor, interpreter, or coordinator, is only one. So their mind is going to go first to the person that they see most often, that they hear from most often, and also the person that makes their job easier. Because if you go to work and you're always complaining, that's not good. That is not going to encourage a supervisor to call you again. You have to learn how to be a team player and make sure that that coordinator or that supervisor knows that you're a team player and you're there to help the workflow better. From the contractor's point of view, I would say that's the most important thing.
What can interpreters do to prepare in advance to interpret in a mediation?
Well, the best thing they can do, and I know it's a lot to ask, is to take a real mediation training. It's maybe 30, 40 hours, so it may be too much to ask, as I said, but then you would know pretty much everything a mediator knows, and you would figure out exactly what you need to do on your own. If that's not possible, you could look online for various videos, so you could at least see what it looks like and get the vibe of a mediation, as well as some of the language and concepts. If you could only read one book, as I mentioned, Getting to Yes would be a book I suggest. It's not specifically about mediation, but it provides the background. It helps you understand what the mediator is trying to do. We also have a Facebook page, Interpret ADR, where you can connect with other interpreters who are interested in this field. And finally, you might want to take a training specifically for interpreters in alternative dispute resolution and mediation. They're hard to find, but they do exist.
What AB5 is, what it was intended to do, and how interpreters got caught in the middle of this.
Okay, so AB5 was created because of the Supreme Court decision, the Dynamics decision. It was a class action suit from delivery drivers that decided to sue their trucking company. This was a class action suit that went to the Supreme Court, and the court decided that they were indeed employees of the company and not independent contractors. What's so interesting about that lawsuit is that every class member worked exclusively for Dynamics. They didn't work for anybody else. In fact, they excluded those who worked for other companies. But because it was an important decision, in fact, a landmark decision, because they dismissed the Borrello case, the one that typically was being used as a case law to prove what an independent contractor is and what an employee is. So they came up with the ABC test. And so the intent of Lorena Gonzalez, which is Assemblywoman from San Diego, was to codify the Supreme Court's decision and protect all the gig economy, misclassified workers, by giving them the protections entitled of employees, benefits, vacation pay, insurance, and so forth. So that was the intent. However, we realized that they created this blanket law that caught everyone by surprise, and it included professionals. And because we work for multiple companies, we work with direct clients, as you said earlier, we were affected by that. And I think it was an unintended consequence, something we needed to correct.
What is a critical incident and why is this important?
Well, a critical incident is a concept taken up from the healthcare settings, where doctors, nurses, all allied professions are required to report any incident when a patient suffers harm. And there are different degrees of harm and criticality of those incidents. So what we thought at CCHI is important because we are an equal member of the team that treats the patient and it communicates with their family, that we need to be mindful of the situation when we interpreters feel that there was something in the communication that didn't go quite well or that caused us some distress. It's one of those moments when I think of it as, your gut feeling like, did I do it right? Did I really say it? So those are the moments that we want to capture so that we can then collectively ponder, discuss, and come up with solutions in terms of either pointing them out, like in these situations, if you're a novice interpreter, even if you're an experienced interpreter, you may experience some discomfort and this is what you should do, or maybe even provide special trainings, special scripts on how to deal with those moments that we encounter. But first we need to collect them to figure out what are those moments incidents in communication where we feel either doubt, frustration, anxiety, or maybe satisfaction and thinking like, oh, that went so well, I need to tell the world about this. So that's what, in a nutshell, what we think of when we say critical incidents.
In your role as the language access program manager in the state of New Jersey, tell me what it is that you found with the interpreters that you did have working for you. What were your main concerns?
My main focus has been trying to establish clear standards for what the profession stands for, and what does it take to enter the profession and succeed as a professional court interpreter. That's a tall order when you've inherited staff interpreters who aren't competent. When we first started, we tested all of our inherited staff court interpreters, and if I remember correctly, only 1 or 2 were able to pass the test the first time. And so we were persona non grata in that community as soon as we started testing. And so our credibility was negative. Not being Hispanic myself didn't help at all. There was this perception that, well, Robert Joe's just this white guy who's out to get us, which I understand. If I've been working for years and everybody told me I was doing a great job, the judges, the bilingual attorneys, and the litigants, nobody knew any different. So if I've been told that all those years, then who's this white guy coming in to test us and tell us that we're not doing our job right? So establishing the credibility of the test was a huge, huge political challenge. So we had our primary test rater go sit down with each person, play their test back to them, show them the rater scripts and how they were graded. And boy, did that introduce a shift from arrogance and anger to humility and embarrassment. Ay, Dios mío, dije eso, no lo creo. And so when we held up a mirror to people so they could really see what they were doing, which nobody had ever done before. These people have been working in the dark, doing what they thought was best, in all honesty and sincerity, to discover that they've been living something of a non-professional life. We went from being their enemies to being their best friends almost overnight. And to their credit, they began to see what they needed to work on. And so we established a tuition reimbursement program, and people who were committed and wanted to stay around, they went and took advantage of free tuition to start improving their knowledge and skills. And I'm proud, one of the things I'm proudest of is that we did not dismiss a single staff court interpreter. They either ultimately passed or they decided, this is really not for me now that I know what it really is. And they went on to other jobs within the courts. No one lost their job. So I'm very proud of how we implemented that very humanely and with great consideration of people who had been just working in the wrong environment with the wrong expectations, all innocence.
What's next for De La Mora in its next 25 years?
Oof, I don't know. I think the first thing we're going to do is continue to offer our training, of course. But I think that we're in a position now to create something. And I'm glad you're doing this with the podcast, because I really would like to have a place, a real community center, let's call it, where interpreters could get together, share ideas, learn from each other. This year, we're launching, and we're going to be sponsoring people to become members of NAGID and to volunteer to their committees. And it wouldn't be a bad idea. And maybe that's what we should go, we should go next, to be a place for people to come and discuss and find ways to improve the training and the pay and everything. And for interpreters to have an opportunity to talk to each other, not in a training environment, but more in a friendly environment. I don't know that I might be jumping the gun, but I'm pretty sure we're going to have some kind of celebration this year for the 25 years. and we'll invite as many people as we can.
Agustín de la Mora, president of De la Mora Institute of Interpretation. Thank you so much for joining us here on Subject to Interpretation, and congratulations on the first 25 years of the Institute's wonderful success, as well as wishing you many, many more years of success.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for being here with us.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, it's been so much fun. Thank you for including me.
Thank you so much, Maria. And thank you to De la Mora Institute. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you for having me over. It's always a pleasure.